Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Alun and I'm working in the Faculty of Foreign Studies at Nagoya Gakuin University. I am also a part-time PhD student at the Centre for Research in English Language Learning and Assessment, University of Bedfordshire in the UK. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the contributions by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science and the British Council. These two bodies provided me with grants without which this project would have been very difficult to carry out successfully. As students are lined up waiting before a speaking test, have you ever heard them say something like, "I hope I get A sensei, he's really kind," or maybe, "I hope I don't get B sensei, he's really strict"? Well, in this ongoing study, I'm interested in understanding if and how rater personality affects the scores that they award to test takers during speaking tests. And thus, the title of my presentation today, Whose Performance Is It Now?, is to underline the concept of tests as social events where performances are co-constructed. More on that shortly. First, let's briefly outline the plan for today's speech. And firstly, I am going to summarize the theoretical rationale, and then I'll cover the research questions. As the study utilizes a mixed methods approach, I will briefly go over the methodology and finally cover some of the early findings in section 4, results. So let's get started. The study draws upon Cyril Weir's socio-cognitive framework, and the diagram on this slide is an updated version that has been modified for speaking tests. The socio-cognitive framework is a roadmap which is used by high-stakes test developers to help validate their speaking tests. As testers, we are constantly trying to ensure that scores reflect test taker ability as accurately and reliably as possible, and that factors other than language proficiency are excluded where possible. Certainly, the socio-cognitive framework provides researchers with a system to do just that, but today I'm going to suggest that it may need to be updated. The two blue dotted lines situate my study within the broader validity landscape, but also home in on the two critical issues at play here, and that's co-construction, line A, and personality traits, line B. McNamara argued that speaking performances are co-constructed. Speaking test scores are not merely a projection of what is in the test taker's head, and research confirms that what examiners say and how they interact with test takers can indeed change the performance. Furthermore, what raters perceive within the performance with regards to those examiner behaviours can also impact final scores. So test scores can reflect factors other than solely L2 proficiency. One of those factors is personality. Research within language testing has shown that test takers' personality, and this is specifically trait extraversion, interacts with elements of a test context, size and composition of interlocutor groupings, and this can influence how much a test taker might decide to say and how they co-construct the discourse. Personality explains some of the variance in test taker behaviour, therefore. Who a test taker is, to some degree, affects how they interact and how much they talk, or do not. That the study of personality in language testing has only been viewed from the point of view of the test taker is curious, especially given our understanding of speaking tests as social events between all participants. Research from the fields of medicine and business have shown small correlations between certain personality traits of raters and greater leniency in scoring. Specifically, it appears that higher agreeableness, higher conscientiousness and higher extroversion predict greater leniency. And so this leaves me pondering whether who we are when acting as raters affects how we judge performance. Formalised into research questions, this idea is expressed on this slide. The first research question is a quantitative one. Are there any relationships between raters' extroversion, agreeableness or conscientiousness and their severity? And the second research question is a qualitative one. How do raters of differing extroversion, agreeableness or conscientiousness perceive various aspects of co-constructed discourse between the examiner and test taker? On the following slide, I'm going to review the methodology which attempts to address these questions. I have included this flowchart because there are a lot of moving parts due to the mixed methods approach used in this study. A mixed methods approach was necessary to address the chief limitation of purely quantitative data. Correlation does not imply causation. While the quantitative data may identify a pattern, it's the qualitative data that will help to explain how or why the pattern formed. To begin, we look at the left side. To generate estimates of severity, I had to get raters to rate something, and so I created 12 video speaking tests. The instrument that I chose to form that material was the Aiken test of English for academic purposes. The TEEP test is a 10-minute interview between one examiner and one test taker. The test has 4 phases: basic interview, role play, extended monologue, and finally extended interview, such that as the test progresses, the cognitive demands placed upon the test taker increase. Raters use an analytic scale for scoring purposes, and the scale consists of 5 categories: pronunciation, lexical range and accuracy, grammatical range and accuracy, fluency, and interactional effectiveness. In each category, a test taker can receive a score that corresponds to the CEFR competency bands. The TEEP scores are then below A2, A2, B1 and B2. The 12 videos were uploaded to a secure online server, and I then enrolled 86 raters from across Japan. They were all native speaker teachers working full or part-time at universities. Each rater received training in the TEEP protocols, and they were then given a password and link to the server where they watched and rated all 12 videos in one session at a time of their choosing. On the final video, raters were asked to provide commentary on the examiner and the rationale for their rating. Finally, once all ratings were submitted, they were then asked to complete a self-report personality inventory. The instrument used to generate the estimates of raters' agreeableness, conscientiousness and extroversion is known as Hexaco, and it operationalizes the most widely accepted theory for personality in modern psychology, the 5-factor model. Rationale was used to generate interval scale measures of rater severity, and that was based on their scores from the videos, and the 3 personality factors under investigation. And this data was then fed into a hierarchical multiple regression. The personality data was also used to identify individuals who were extremely high or extremely low in any of the 3 personality traits. 8 individuals were selected and agreed to a stimulated recall interview where they were asked to review specific events from the video material and provide further detailed commentary on what they observed of the test taker and the examiner's interaction and how they judged the performance. Both this interview data as well as the written commentary from all 86 raters formed the basis for a thematic analysis to address research question 2. Let's move on to the next slide. Before we go over the quantitative results, I find it useful to provide an overview of the variables input into the hierarchical multiple regression. The dependent variable was termed rate of severity, and this was an interval scale estimate where positive values indicate higher severity and negative values denote leniency. The 3 independent variables, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, were also interval scale estimates where positive values indicate greater extroversion, agreeableness and conscientiousness, and negative values indicate introversion, disagreeableness and carelessness. Finally, there were 4 control variables also included in this study. Sex was a categorical variable with 2 conditions, 0 or 1. Time teaching was an interval scale variable that recorded the length of time in months that participants had been teaching in Japan. Test experience time was an interval scale variable that recorded the amount of experience, again in months, that participants had as either examiners or raters prior to enrolling in this study. And then finally, test experience level was a categorical variable with 3 conditions, 0, 1 or 2, that qualified the type of prior experience in testing, whether participants were inexperienced, had some form of in-house training with their university, or had worked for large-scale standardized testing bodies such as IELTS or ACAN. On this slide, you can see the output from the hierarchical multiple regression with the key information highlighted in orange. The results indicate a complex interaction between 2 personality traits and a demographic control variable, all of which predict rate of severity. Findings are statistically significant where the alpha level is set to 5%. Test experience level was a statistically significant predictor of rate of severity that accounted for almost half, 10.6%, of the total variance in rate of severity. The regression coefficient associated with raters' test experience level indicated that with each additional category increase in experience, rate of severity decreased by a little over 1/3 of a unit on the interval scale. The second largest predictor was agreeableness, which explained a further 8.6% of the variance in rate of severity. The regression coefficient associated with agreeableness implied that when this personality trait increased by 1 unit of the interval scale, rate of severity decreased by a little over half a unit. Finally, extroversion explained the remaining 4.3% of variance in rate of severity. The regression coefficient associated with extroversion suggested that when this trait increased by 1 unit of the interval scale, rate of severity also increased by 1/3 of a unit. What I would like to do at this point is to contextualize these results on the next slide. Alright, so talk of coefficients and variance is referring to trends across a sample, but what does this all mean at a more granular or personal level? To illustrate the effect that these 3 predictors have had on individual scoring, we can use Rationale to generate fair average scores. Fair averages tell us what score each rater would have given the same hypothetical test taker had all factors been held constant. What we find when we do so is quite telling. In the table on this slide, I've posted the data of the two most extreme raters from both ends of the sample distribution, and I've put them side by side for direct comparison. Rater 7 was the most lenient rater, who was neither extrovert nor introvert, but high in agreeableness and also trained in Aiken STEP, which is a speaking test in Japan. Rater 62 was the most severe and was somewhat extrovert, of neutral agreeableness and inexperienced with any form of speaking test. Where our most severe rater would award a test taker an A1 on the CEFR scale, our most lenient rater would have rated that very same performance at B1. So on the final slide, I would like to introduce some of the early findings from the thematic analysis, because I want to know, look, how is it that raters 7 and 62 arrived at such vastly different scores? What are they seeing or not seeing? How are they processing those observations? So let's look at that data next. For their final video rating, each rater was asked to volunteer their observations on the test interaction and their rationale for scoring. All 86 raters provided some form of commentary. From this, a total of 206 thematic codes were generated. 28% of the sample, so 26 raters' comments, were independently co-coded by two external coders with a 91% agreement rate. The alluvial diagram in the centre provides a visual overview of the relative contributions and connections between the macro themes on the left with their respective sub-themes on the right. There were three overarching macro themes to the commentary, of which examiner perceptions was the largest, and this is indicated in the diagram with the blue filaments. Examiner perceptions comprised 72.3% of the 206 codes. Cognitive approaches, indicated by the peach filaments, accounted for 21.4% of the data, with the remaining 6.3% of the codes being test taker perceptions, coloured here in brown. The analysis is still ongoing. However, I would like to just whet your appetite with a few early findings. The examiner perceptions theme categorises the different types of observations made by raters with regards to examiners' linguistic, non-linguistic or test management behaviours. The most frequent observation of examiners was how well they established rapport. There seems to have been a consensus among the rater sample that making test takers feel at ease and creating a positive test environment was an important and expected job of the examiners. Raters consider rapport to be established via demeanour, so body language, friendly and polite instructions, and conveying interest in the test taker. I have an example excerpt in support here from rater 18 at the top right. Her voice was reassuring, she smiled, she made eye contact and used physical back-channeling, nodding, as well as verbal back-channeling. This rapport subtheme provides further evidence towards McNamara's theory on the nature of speaking tests as social events where performances are co-constructed. The cognitive approach theme consisted of 6 subthemes which categorise the ways that raters mentally process performances to arrive at judgments. The most frequent cognitive approach from this dataset was termed global. Raters tended towards overall impressions of language performance rather than citing specific criteria as evidence of proficiency. An example of the global approach would be in rater 52's comment. The candidate is quite natural in her speech. The test taker perception theme consisted of 7 subthemes which categorised the different types of linguistic and non-linguistic behaviours of the test takers. The most frequent observation here was task fulfillment, and this referenced the degree to which test takers diverged from the task, or if communication broke down and thus the task could not be completed. Task fulfillment is exemplified by rater 50's comment, "I graded her slightly lower because she was not quite on task." What task fulfillment subtheme seems to again support is the notion that some raters appear to be creating generalized, impressionistic summaries of test taker proficiency, rather than citing specific instances of performance in reference to rating scale criteria. Over the coming months, the research will be delving deeper and examining these themes in the context of raters' personality and test experience to see whether who they are affects what they perceive or how they judge. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for stopping by.